everyone, and welcome into the studio Stitched by Susan. I'm Susan Smith. We're working in the sewing corner of my studio tonight and working on the quilt that you see behind me. I call it my Scrappy Strippy Chevron. And this is episode 2 of several live episodes in a series talking about this quilt. In the description below every episode, I'm putting a link to the free pattern so that you can follow along if you wish. And this quilt is devised chiefly because I do a lot of long arm quilting, and I've arranged with a lot of my clients that they let me keep the top kind of slimmest trimmings off that backing of the quilt. So I have a lot of strips in my stash that look like this, 2 to 3, maybe 4 inches wide. And so whenever I get baskets overflowing of those strips, it's time to make a Scrappy Strippy Chevron, and I trip over that every time. I'm casting my head around looking for my focus fabric. Here it is. So last week the topic kind of was choosing the scraps that I want to use. And absolutely, if you like just reaching into the basket and pulling out a strip and throwing it on, you be you. Do it your way. But I personally like to curate my scraps a little bit and have kind of a theme to the quilt that I'm working on. So this time I chose this focus fabric. It's a K facet print. I just love the colors in here. And what this does for me, I'll bring it a little closer, is it enables me to look at all these colors and use those greens, those pinks, those teals and aquas. And I leave out then things that are wildly different, like bright red or hot pink or even white. There's no actual white in this print. And so it just helps me narrow down my choices. And so as I've been working on it, maybe I'll grab one and bring it closer. I think it's kind of remarkable how when I sew a batch of these strips together, it reminds you of this focus fabric. So I'm really thrilled with the results. So that's what we were talking about last week, going through my scrap bins, talking about what lengths and how I kind of curate them and pull this theme together. From there, I only did trimming in the sense that like I wanted my strips to have straight edges and to be even widths, right? I don't want them to be wonky at all. So I took them to my cutting mat and I made sure that they were cut straight. I pressed them if they were crazy wrinkly, and they're anywhere from about 1 inch to, I do have some that are 2.5 inches wide in here, and I'm starting to trim those down because I actually don't like such a big old chunk of color. So anywhere from 1 inch to like 2 inches to me is about ideal. Personal preference. Again, you do you and based on sort of what strips you have. A few of you asked last week if I'm going to actually use the focus fabric, and I said yes, this is all I have right here. It's this much. But I've actually decided I'm not going to, because I want to be able to take some photos after the quilt is finished and show this piece and then show the result and kind of see how good I did and be able to show how that's a great tool for curating fabrics to use in a scrappy quilt, especially in a strippy one like this. So I've got beside me here my regular like dressmaker's ironing board, and I've just got it set a little bit lower, and all my strips are laying over that. And the only organization I did was I have my super long ones at one end and kind of my mid and my short. And then I just rummage through them as I'm sewing and try to get a mix in each of these chevrons. So what I want to do today, I will sew a little bit, but I kind of want to start by giving you some really good tips for making this fairly pain-free. We are working with angles, and so it can be trickier to measure, and I've got some really good shortcuts for that and for how to keep a randomized look in your strips. So we're just going to talk through some of the parts that I've got partway done, and I'm going to start by showing you a close-up of my cutting mat. And Mr. Producer is here for this early part. So he's going to help me get a camera set up so that we can show you my cutting mat, and I'll show you the cutting kind of jig that I figured out. Okay, so let me just move this out of the way. Actually, one more thing before I do that. I do want to show you, for those of you who are new tonight and didn't catch the first episode, this is the pattern we're working on, the Scrappy Strippy Chevron. Again, it is a free pattern. It's my adaptation of one that has been in the public domain on the internet for years and years. So I fiddled with it a little bit and kind of made it my own and summarized some of my instructions. It's not a highly detailed pattern. You need to know how to sew, but the important thing that's in it is this layout that's kind of on graph paper, and I'll talk about that and how it relates to my design wall more as we go along. But again, last week I cut out all the, you can see it, all the background pieces, and I literally put them all in place on the design wall. And the white holes that you're seeing are my batting design surface, where I haven't put any scrappy strips yet. And so I like to fill in all that background, and then hole by hole by hole, I fill it up. And you're seeing this with all big X's on it. Can you see that? Because I'm literally Sharpieing off the ones that I fill in as I go, so I know what's left to do. I find that helpful. That's up to you. Okay, so that's the pattern. And again, it's in the description right below this episode. You might need to click on See More to get the description of what we're doing today, and that free pattern is on there. Okay, so now let's have a look at my cutting mat. Oh, you've got the buzzer? All right. Doesn't this look fabulous? You probably look at this and wonder, what the heck is all that blue painter's tape? It's one more use for blue painter's tape that is absolutely genius. Here's how I use it. Every time I'm cutting an angle, this is my 45-degree angle, so I'm doing lots of cutting there. This is always my point that I line my piece up to, right there. And what these are is kind of like cutting jigs, like carpenters would do, or maybe metal workers would do, that just tell me where my approximate ruler position is. I mean, if it was a jig for a carpenter, it would be precise. But all I wanted to know is, where's my 4.5-inch width? Where's my 6.5 inch? And where's my 8.5? So I don't have to be counting every time, right? And trying to keep track and line up my ruler and not twist it. It just saves a ton of headache. That was Mr. Producer. Tisk, tisk. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, type them into the comments, and I'll take a minute here shortly to look at the comments. So basically, again, I marked where my corner was. I always use that starting corner. I always line up my pieced strip with a long line so that I know my 45-degree angle is exactly right? And then these little markings are my little jigs for my 4.5-inch wide piece, my 6.5, and my 8.5. And then for this side, it's easier to measure the 6.5 or the 8.5. We're used to doing that with these lines, right? It's the angled ones that are trickier. So I find that to be incredibly helpful. What else do I want to show at the cutting mat? I think that's it. We'll talk about this funny looking piece as we go. That's another topic. Let's see if there's some good questions coming in. We changed cameras a little bit today to see if we can get me to show up a little bit when I'm looking at the screens here. Sharon printed off the pattern, looking forward to making this scrappy quilt. Good. I wanted to add too, also in the description is, which camera am I looking at? This one. Also in the description is a link to my blog page. And so a couple of years back, I had done this in blog format. And so I had written out the descriptions and a lot of photos and some details in there. So we're re-releasing those as these sessions are going live. So that's a good place to refer back to too, if you like to read or look at the photos and maybe not take the time to rewatch this live. So it's a great other resource for you. Nadia, good evening from Switzerland. Welcome. Mary in, oh my word, I can't even say it, north of Barrie, Ontario. So glad you're here, Mary. Judy, hello from Alberta, where spring is lurking. Yes, spring is lurking here too. Welcome to mud season. Sherry, Carol, Brenda, Sandra, Pauline, in Australia, cyclone fizzled to rain and wind, so I'm loving being trapped inside. Isn't it lovely to be trapped inside sometimes? I'm totally agreeing. Jerry, Diane, Pat, Pamela, so-and-so. Hello, everyone. It's safe to say I haven't sorted out fabric for this, hopefully soon. And the good news is these episodes are going to live on YouTube, and likewise the blog posts will live on my blog, so you can always refer back into them. And Austin is tuning in. Austin, near the end of last week's show, you asked about getting some scraps because you haven't had much time to accumulate them. And I was already off air before I saw that comment, so I was hoping you would tune in again. So stay tuned, because if you do still want some scraps, I'll get you to email into us, support@StitchedBySusan.com. And Austin, just for you, because you're a beginning quilter, I'm going to ship you off some scraps and some of the bits that I don't use in mine because I've got way too many cut. Cheryl, Pat, Miriam, Nita, Janet, Pamela, I have to wait to put this together until I go north where all my scraps are. Tammy, Janelle, Cindy, Gloria, Nita, I couldn't get the pattern to print. You might email also support@stitchedbysusan.com. Erin might have a tip for you. It is a PDF. It should be easily printable, and I've tested it. So maybe try refreshing, reloading it. Any other suggestions, Mr. Producer? That's where I'd start. Laura, Debbie, Laura, spending this time ripping a whole pass at the long arm. I am sincerely sorry. I've been there. Robin, Rose. So no one's asking questions so far about this, but very lovely to have greetings from all of you. I sure appreciate that. Okay, I'll keep going then on the chatting about the stuff.
Camera.
Okay, got to switch cameras here. This one. Yep. Is that right? That's still the same camera, isn't it, Dave?
Go back one.
There we go. Okay, we want the big camera. I want you to be able to see my design wall again. I have a few more things to point out for you in terms of building these chevron strips. So initially, I start by just putting a few long ones together. And this is kind of why at my ironing board I liked to sort out the long ones with the fabric or more, right? Long strips. So they look something like this, right? Long strips. And so I started by making a few long stripped blocks like that. And I start them with an even edge like this. So you might think because we're cutting them on that 45-degree angle that you need to start them that way. And as you progress further in your quilt and only need a few, you might be able to stagger them that way. But to begin with, I start with them straight, or mostly straight, because I've got all these end pieces to fill. And likewise at the bottom of the quilt, right? So my first angled cut makes a hunk that looks like this, which fits in this little area. And because I've got some chevrons that are 8.5 inches and some that are 6.5, what happens is the points at the top don't all reach the same level. So you can see here, this is my highest point, and I want that to be where I trim my quilt when it's all sewn together. I'm going to trim just 1/4 inch beyond that point. So then it's important that I leave these little pieces with some excess, so I'm sure they reach up there, right? So a little more will save you headache rather than cutting it so very, very close, okay? So that's one thing. Another is, I think there's an easier way to show you. Let's see. I had a piece there, and where did I take it? Right here, when I was talking to you guys. Can we see both of these on camera? You can. Can you see that this piece and this piece were cut out of the exact same strip? All I did was turn them 180 degrees. So that's a super tip for being able to keep that randomization throughout your quilt and not have them look the same, because they're actually fairly close to each other in the quilt, and I wouldn't really love for them to look identical that close to each other, right? But if I can't mix them up throughout, then an easy way is literally to just rotate them 180 degrees. So that's a great tip. Another is, if you get a few pieces cut with this angle and now you need some with this angle, here's a way that you can do it. Let me make sure I get the right example here. I'll just take this one out so you can visualize without that. Okay. Can you see how this one and this one are the same stripes, right? And at some point, I knew I needed this angle and then that angle. So I left some space in between, cut this angle, cut straight across, and cut the next angle. And that's what gave me this corner. And there's one like it on the bottom. Does that make sense? So that's how I'm trying to use up the most of my fabric that I can, while still realizing like it's not going to be perfect. I can't use every tiny square inch. From there, I definitely like to begin building this as I construct the pieces. And I construct, and then I cut, and I place them, and then I repeat. Construct, cut, place. Sometimes rearranging, not usually rearranging till I'm at the end. But as I start to fill it in, I start to have a sense of whether or not I like a thing. So for example, this piece right here, when I get this onto the quilt, I feel like it's actually a little too toothpastey green for the rest of the greens. And if I hold it up to my focus fabric, can you see that difference? It's just got a different flavor. Did I take it out? No, I did not. But I took out the rest of the pieces out of my strip mix so I wouldn't get more of them. And in this case, look, this one doesn't have quite enough for the corner. Can you see that white edge? So I am actually going to take this one chunk off, replace it with something else, and trim it all into shape. But that's going to wait for later. Okay, what else have I done to change? This is another good example. This piece right here was in one of the earliest huge strips that I made, so I had quite a few chunks that had this dark piece. I actually don't love it. It's quite a bit darker than anything else in the quilt. So I left it in the ones that were tiny, like that one has it, this one has it, but I had some that had a bigger chunk, like so, and I did take that out. It was on the end of a strip, so it was fairly easy to take off and replace. And again, any more pieces that I had like this, or I had like some really, really, really dark teal, it's right here, I just took those out of the mix and didn't put any more in. So now then, I'm just going to keep filling until it's done, till I have all the pieces made, and then I'll take one last check. And if there are any in identical size that I'd rather trade for one elsewhere in identical size, I might still do that a little bit. But otherwise, I'm just going to keep filling this up as I go and keep kind of judging. Do I want more green? Do I want less green? Do I want a little more gold to show up? Etc. And that's just how I'm kind of planning it as I go. And I bet some of you are going to ask this, so I'm going to preempt you and answer the question. Last week I was rummaging through my scrap baskets and someone asked, do you have enough strips? And I didn't think so. But as I got trimming and cutting and then started sewing, turns out I have tons of them. But at first I didn't think I did, so I got a couple chunks out of my stash. So still fabric, in many cases left over from other quilts, but still, you know, chunks with the fabric. And I did cut one, and one only. And that was this purple piece. And I'm not sorry, because currently that is one of my favorite colors, that rich, not royal purple, but much deeper than lavender. I just love that color. So I did cut two with the fabric strips out of my stash, but the rest of it is all scraps out of my scrappy bins. Okay. Camera, whoops, sorry. That's a novice mistake. Back to the other camera. Let's get to the rest of the comments. Betty, Austin, yay, I'm so excited, good. Gloria, how much solid yardage did you buy for the larger quilt? I'll answer that one in a second. Gloria, Austin is still fun when a celebrity notices you. Okay, Austin, I am so not a celebrity, but thanks for that. Marion, quilting on my long arm and listening, super. Okay, Gloria asked how much solid yardage. That is something I didn't include in the pattern because I didn't honestly know exactly how much. But I did count mine as I was cutting, so I now have a guideline, and I can tell you that. Of the 6.5 inch wide, I cut 4 with the fabric. And of the 8.5 inch wide, I cut 5 with the fabric. Now, note that my background fabric is a linen cotton blend, so it doesn't have a right and wrong side. So I was able to flip-flop pieces. So if you do have fabric that's got a distinct right and wrong side, you might need a little bit more because you might have a little more fabric wastage as you're trying to get all the angles that you need. But that'll give you a starting point. So 4 times width of fabric, 6.5 inches, 5 times width the fabric at 8.5 inches. Okay, so that will help you get going. All right, I think we're gonna do some sewing. Let's put me back on the big camera. Let's see if I can push the right button this time. Managed it. Let's do some sewing and cutting. Let me get this one back up on the wall. I think it was here. Yep. I'm pretty pleased. Like seriously, I'm pleased that when I look at this focus fabric and I hold it up next to this, like it kind of looks like that. And originally I thought too, this has a lot of green in it. And originally I thought, well, I don't necessarily want my quilt to be that green. I don't necessarily want this ratio of colors. But I'm finding that I really love the green, and it's clear because I have quite a lot of scraps of the green. So it's ending up in the quilt quite a lot, and I'm happy with that. Okay, let's put these scrappy bits away. Let Susan get a sip of coffee, and we'll get sewing. All right. This is a set that I had some fairly longish strips. There were more that came out this way, and I've cut some angles off, but as you can see, I've run out of this one, but there's still quite a few more of these fabrics. I welcome that because all I do then is take that little bit off, and sometimes it's one snippet and sometimes it's 2 or 3 snippets, and then I add other things onto it than the other chevrons had, right? Different things, and so now it will look a little bit different. So I just continue to use sort of every square inch until this length is exhausted. So I'll find a piece that's similar in length. I can start a little shorter because I am going to cut that angle, right? So I can stagger them just a little bit. Let's see. Do we want another purple? I say yes. Let's do it. Unless you guys really, really want to, I won't keep flipping to the camera that shows my sewing machine because there's nothing magical about the sewing. I'm literally just sewing a 1/4 inch flat seam. If anyone is not familiar with a leader ender, or quilters sometimes call them a spider, this is just a little piece of batting, and I put it under the needle and sew through it between every seam. It keeps my thread tails from ever making rat's nests then on the back of my sewing, and I like that. Okay, you guys have to bear with me because I hardly have any room for pressing because I've got my cutting mat here. So it's going to be a bit of a process. This tip though will help you too, and can you see from there? I kept, excuse me, I kept 2 pieces of my background. One of them 6.5 wide and one of them 8.5. Can you kind of sort of see that? And the reason I did that is so that when I'm busy piecing like this, I can lay one of these on it and quickly see, is it wide enough or does it need another piece? And look at this. If I hold that gray one on there, can you see that? It's just wide enough for a 6.5 inch piece. So perfect. I'm going to go cut that into something. Also, new addition to my quilting studio, I put a little pop socket on my ruler. I don't use it for cutting. I still put my hand on it, but I use it for picking the ruler up, and it's very nice. So I'm using my trusty little cutting jig here and lining up my point by my blue painter's tape, using the 45-degree angle, and usually I would cut at a table that's much lower than this, so I'm just going to cut slowly and carefully because this is not tall like this is not the perfect angle for cutting, but it is the perfect angle for you guys seeing. So now I'll just scooch my ruler to my little 6.5 inch markings. And my blue painter's tape is not precise, it just tells me what marking on the mat to grab. And there we go. Boom. Where shall we put this little gaffer? Right here. Okay, and then I need my trusty marker, and I jot down where I put that. As your quilt gets fuller and fuller and fuller, this becomes more important, especially if, like me, typically my cutting is in the next room through this door. And so to try and know which angle I need to cut and what size I need to cut it, I like to have my little reference sheet in place. Do we need more of that angle? Yeah, we do. We still need a couple up there. But I don't think I can get them out of this piece, right? I don't have enough angle, so I'm just going to trim this off, and it will be one of my little tails at the top or bottom. And I don't have to trim it precisely. I'm just going to get rid of the great long tails. Do I still need one? I actually don't need one anymore, but I'm going to keep it in case one of the others is too small. I've learned this too. The further I go along, like early on, I can sort of use every piece, but near the end, I just can't, and I just have to keep reminding myself, it's scraps anyways, just use them up as best you can. Okay, here's another great example. See how I had super long strips on this one to begin with, and then I had about 24-inch long strips that I sewed beside, and I've cut off a couple chunks. You see this one is here, I think, yep, right here. So now I'm going to start undoing right at this green. I'm just going to take this portion off and put something totally different on beside it. If I still needed a 4.5 inch piece, I could have probably gotten it out of here, but I've already got those all cut. I don't use a lot of finesse. I just yank it off. Let's see if we have a few more comments or questions. Mary and Carol and Susan, was your background fabric 45 inches wide? Yes, it was. Okay, your blue tape tip will certainly help me a lot. Thank you. I mean, those of you who watch me know that I use blue painter's tape for many, many, many things. This is just one of them, but it is just so helpful and easy to remove when you're done. Nita, here's an idea for a label. Cut a 3x3 square of your focus fabric and center a label or embroider on a solid gray and center it on the focus fabric for the backing. Nita, that is a fantastic idea. Thank you. Let me add that to the broadcast so someone else could read it. Ooh, that's tiny. Hope you guys are watching on a big screen. Brenda, okay, I love this one. Hooray, my first time catching you live. Thank you to my butcher husband for letting me use his computer. Yes, we do thank you, sir. Anita has an additional idea, or a strip of focus fabric added to the backing fabric, like 1.5 inch of a strip of the focus fabric sewn into the backing. Yes, good ideas. I have not for sure decided what my backing is going to be yet. I'm kind of going to wait till it's all done and I kind of get that flavor, but trust me, it's coming out of my stash. Laurel, I'm loving this. David Smith, hello from the end of the hallway. Okay. So now I've got this down to my 3 kind of basic pieces, and I'm just going to make sure I need that angle. I need one. I only need one more piece with this angle. So I think I'm going to go with this end where they're straight, and I'm going to add on this way because I need quite a few that are cut in this angle still. Okay, what should we put on next? There is no wrong decision. We're going to go green. I'm loving green. I'm just loving these greens right now. So on they go. You can actually see me at the sewing machine this time. I'll leave that camera up for a little bit. Last week I mentioned we're trying out a new camera that tracks me, that follows me. And in general, most of you had very good reviews on that, but there were 1 or 2 people that it kind of made them a little seasick. So I thought, well, I'll try and get a little happy medium. And use the still camera some of the time and the tracking camera some of the time. It certainly makes it easier for me when I'm trying to walk back and forth between things as I am with these sewing sessions to not have to keep switching camera view. It's very convenient. In case anybody cares, we do have that one specialty camera on tonight, but all the other cameras that we're using, we only have 2 others tonight, I guess. The other cameras are literally just our smartphones. We're not very fancy YouTubers, Dave and I. We just do it with the smartphones. It works pretty good.
Fix the comments. Change your camera back too. So I think I'm this one now.
I'm on the side one now. No, I'm on the tracking one. Oh, you changed it. Yeah,
I might
okay.
have done that as I was doing.
Nope, very good. So I'm literally just keeping these little bits and bobs that I'm not sure that they'll be useful anymore, but just in case, I'll just hang on to them till the whole thing's done. Now I gotta kind of fiddle with my pressing space here to get a little room. I do love, and I'm sorry you're kind of seeing the back of my head, I do love having a square or rectangular pressing surface when I'm working on a quilt like this, because there are so many bias cuts. it helps me to have a straight line to press things against. Even when I'm doing this long strip piecing, right? If I didn't have my cutting mat here, I'd be stretching this out the whole length of my ironing surface, which is 48 inches long. The whole width of fabric fits on it, so that I could be steaming it beautifully flat and straight, and I don't get that curvature. And I might add a word of caution here. Because you are sewing long strips together, it kind of does matter that your sewing machine's timing is well set and that your tension is well set, or you're going to be struggling with long pieces that want to curve. So it's worth taking a minute to adjust your tension. I have occasionally found on my machine that when my seams are almost pulling tight all the way along, my tension is correct in that the threads are knotting in the middle of the layers, and yet they're both too tight and the thread is just pulling tighter than the fabric. So sometimes I have found if I loosen my bottom tension a little and loosen my top tension on my sewing machine a little, I'll get a smoother, flatter seam when I'm stitching. But certainly when I sew, I tend to lay down my 2 layers for 6 or 8 inches in front of my needle and hold them in place. If you don't have enough flat surface to do that, it's probably worth pinning so that you don't get one easing up with another. And I've got my Bernina with the dual feed attached as well. So do everything you can think of to help that process of getting a nice, long, straight group of seams. What's next? I think yellow. We're just going to stick on this camera for a bit. Seems like every time I swap scenes, I do it the wrong way. So, Nita, thank you very much for your idea for the label. I really like that idea. It will allow me to keep some of my focus fabric, but tie the whole thing together on the back. I attended a little workshop at QuiltCon. It was in the Wonderfill booth, and it was on labeling quilts. And she really encouraged us, even if you do the simplest label, to at least put a name and a date on quilts that we make. And I'm talking at this point in my life, I don't even know how many quilts I've made. 200 for sure. Do 6 of them have labels? Maybe. And that's terrible. It's terrible. My conscience was pricked. I was like, seriously, I know how to sew. I can make simple labels. So thanks for giving me a good idea, Nita, and I will follow through and put a label on this quilt. I don't know who it's for yet, but at least 2 family friends are getting married this upcoming summer with kids. And so I do love to have a few quilts on hand for gifting at any given moment. So this may be one of those. I'm fortunate to have the Laura Star iron, which is super steamy, as you can hear. But if you don't have that, I used to follow the practice of literally pressing my seam first, like flat down. It kind of sets the thread into the seam, nice and smooth and flat, and gives you a sharper crease. I don't have to do that with the Laura Star. It kind of does all that in one step because of the massive steam. But even so, treat your strips and eventually treat your chevrons gently, because they really can shift and pull out of shape. And the more careful you are with that, the better result you're going to get. Let's see how we're getting. I'm pretty sure we're not wide enough. No, but one more piece will do it. Okay, what else are we going to put on here? Let's try and find something I haven't used yet. I think we're going to do another green, you guys. It's a long one, but I have tons of this, so I'll just trim it off at the end. It's actually not that much longer. It's perfect. What do you know? There's a story behind this fabric, actually. Not too long after I started long arming, which in February was 10 years, a local business owner was closing her fabric shop, and she worked out of her home, but she had quite modern, quite contemporary fabrics, a lot of tulip ink, Allison glass, this sort of thing. And so she had a couple of kind of garage sales, like in a parking lot with a tent type thing, to sell off a lot of her fabric. And I went to one of those and I asked her, I said, when you're all done having these sales, could I have the option of purchasing whatever's left? So long story short, I did that, and I think I came home with 63 bolts and partial bolts. Few of them were totally full. So that was 10 years ago, and I still have a few of the bolts, but mostly that's been my backings all these years, and I've given tons of it away. And so happily, not too many months ago, maybe 5 or 6 months ago, another local shop was closing their doors. They were retiring. And so I was able to go to their store and get another whack of bolts of great backing fabrics. Anyway, the story I started telling was this green fabric. I think it is, let me see if there's a selvage on that I can read. Nope. But I think it's an Allison glass. I'm not 100% sure on that. Anyway, I got that same print, this kind of polka dotty, blotchy print in green and in aqua and in navy, yards and yards and yards. So I feel like I've been using this print for forever. So Austin, there's going to be some of this in your little packet, because I'm ready to be done with this particular fabric. You can use it in so many quilts, and then you're like, someone else can use it. I am done. Okay, I'm going to press. We're going to take a sec for comments, and then I'm going to stop talking while I cut, because I'm just afraid if I try and talk while I do it, I will cut the wrong direction on one of these angles. So great time to put your comments in. It takes them a minute or two to register at my end, so pop them in, comments, questions. I wonder if I could do this way and I wouldn't be pressing at such an awkward angle for me. Maybe. Maybe not. We're going to give it a try. There's just nowhere to put the mat. There we go, that works. Pretty good. And here again, I'm just taking advantage of the straight edges. The straight edge of my mat is next to me, just to kind of steam this as flat as I possibly can and try to avoid having curvature in it at all. That makes it really hard to cut accurate chevrons. Okay, let's have a look at the comments. Look at that, I got the right camera view. Okay. Pauline, hey David. Rose, watching on my TV, almost like you're in my studio with me. Yes, I must be about life size on your TV. Austin's greeting David. Pauline, this is the first time I've watched live, as time conversion to Aussie time doesn't usually suit, so I'm excited. We do keep messing around with the times a little bit, evening, afternoon, morning. I don't know, maybe that's the best, is to just vary the time so everyone gets a little of it. Juliana, what do you think about standing while sewing? Did it take time to get used to running the foot pedal while standing? What brand of table do you have? Super questions. I was just thinking, Juliana, that I needed to talk about my table. It's by Horn of America, and I am very grateful because Stitch House of Dallas, Texas gifted me this table, and I absolutely love it. So watch this. It has this electronic lift and lower. Can you see that? So I typically run with it at its top point, which is 48 inches. 40 inches, my mistake. I love sewing standing. I like to move around when I'm working, so obviously it aids in that. And typically my machine is swung around in front of my window and I walk back and forth to my pressing table just because I don't want to just be sitting while I'm working. So I prefer to make myself walk, and it's easier when I'm always standing. It did not take me very long to get used to using the foot pedal, no. The only time that I don't care for it is when I'm binding a quilt, because I usually have a big quilt and I want to keep the weight up. And so I will usually lower it at that point and sit in front of it. And then I'll either open the drawer or I'll set my little ironing board beside me that's that low height too, just to hold up that weight. It doesn't work well to have to be standing and have the quilt pulling forward or back, right? But when I'm just sewing, I love sewing standing. That's pretty much all I do when I'm sewing. So I love that. So huge thanks to Stitch House. Mine came fitted to I have a Bernina 770 sewing machine. So this little clear plexi that you're seeing right here, you order it to fit whatever machine you have. And so then it just slots right around the machine quite nicely. I love it. Nita, my son encourages me to always create a label with a date for each quilt. Yes, such a good point. And maybe let me throw out there in the questions to you guys, what kind of pen do you use for that? Or do you prefer to actually embroider it? Does that hold up better to repeated washings? Marcia is asking, have you ever made this with a print background? How effective would that be? I feel like a print background and these very mixed print chevrons would not work well. You might try doing a print background and solid strips if indeed you have tons and tons of solid scraps. I've not tried it, but I think the two prints would just get super, super muddy. Now I do think you don't have to have a perfectly solid one. I've got the Essex Linen Blend, but for example, a grunge type fabric that's got a little mottling in it or something that's got a bit of a weave look in it, I think that would be totally fine, a bit textural. But I think an actual floral or print would just be too much. It would blur the lines of the chevrons so much. Maggie, thanks again for making such thoughtful videos I'm watching this evening. I especially like watching long arm videos. Good to know, Maggie. I'm just, quite honestly, my YouTube channel is generally me just airing what I'm working on. And I'm more set up for airing the long arm, so that's what you see oftener. But I was just in the mood to make a scrappy quilt, so here's where we are. Okay. Let's go back to our other camera. Perfect. And start cutting this one. Move a few things out of the way. So I need pieces that my 45-degree angle on my cutting mat only goes one direction. So if I need the reverse angle, I just flip it upside down and cut it from the wrong side. And follow exactly the same procedures. So again, I'm lining up the edge of my strip with a marking line on the mat so that I know it's straight. And when I cut that angled line, it will therefore be accurately on the 45-degree angle. And sometimes if I do have a tiny little bit of curvature in my piece, I'll take the time between a strip to kind of trim up the end again. And I find that is effective. So don't think like you've failed if you've got a little bit of angling going on in there. You can fix that. And sometimes you can also fix it by just kind of tugging on it a little bit or steaming it a little bit because it is so much bias. It does have a little bit of malleability. I would do that before you cut it though. Get it, straight on your board and get that 45-degree trimmed. Steam it into place if it's not laying straight on your board. Okay, let's just make sure 6.5 is what we need. And I'll double check on my wall. I actually need both 6.5 and 8.5. So let's do the 8.5 first. Makes sense to do the biggest ones first, yeah? So again, I've cut my angle, but my strip is not precisely the right width. So while it's still laying on here, while I can see all the marking lines, I'm going to go ahead and line up my ruler at that 6.5 inch line and just trim the merest little hair off the edge. There we go. Here it is. This actually comes together surprisingly quickly. The sorting of the scraps and the trimming them into shape is the most time-consuming part, I think. And I do have a tiny bit of curvature, so all I'm going to do is scooch it forward a little bit past that 45-degree line, get the length of it on the straight line again, and trim this angle. And at one side I'm trimming a little more than 1/8 of an inch off, and at the other end nothing. But it will make it much easier to sew together if I keep that as accurate as possible. And I'm going to see if I can put the same piece above the one I just did. I don't love that because the solid blue is right in the middle, so let's put it elsewhere. Okay, let's mark those two on my sheet. That one and that one. And you notice that I do need a few on my design wall that are wider, that are the 8.5 inch width. So really at any point I can take this layout of stripes, go and add a few more pieces to it and make it wider. It's super flexible in that way. Let me see, this one, nope, that's an 8.5. I don't want to put another one in here that's the same stripe, so I'm going to go for this one next, so it needs to be wider. So I'm literally just going to sew a couple more pieces on here and make it wider. Easy peasy. Go on this side. Let's put some gold. We've got a lot of orange on there. How about my trusty purple? Beautiful. Where'd my little doodad go? There he is. My little spider. Let's stop for half a second in case someone is just tuning in and do a quick rundown on what we're doing here. I am making a Scrappy Strippy Chevron quilt. And you can see the one forming behind me that we're working on. It is my own pattern, but it is a adaptation of chevron quilts that I've seen on the internet in the public domain for years and years. I just made it into this kind of little graph paper layout so that there's measurements and sizes for a baby quilt and a lap quilt, which is what you see here behind me. I think my finished measurements are somewhere here. Who knows? Anyway, baby and lap quilt. The beauty of this quilt is that it lends itself to, can you see this? To strips, and you're seeing that as I'm piecing these long strips together. So if your scraps tend to be of the strippy variety, this is a really good one. And the way I approached it is in episode 1, I showed you my focus fabric. It's a K facet print, and how I kind of went through my bin of scraps and curated them to be these tones, this type of purple, this type of green, the teal, the aqua, no true blue, no red, no pink, 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 just a dusty rose. So whatever colors are in here, those are the colors that I picked. So that's how I curated my strips. And then I trimmed them up from about 1 inch to about 2 1/4 or 2 inches wide. No particular width, like they don't have to be on the 1/4 inch. Just cut, slide your ruler, cut somewhere in that width. But you do need them to be even in width. You don't want wavy lines. You don't want wonky edges. So from there, I've just started sewing these strips and cutting them into the chevron shapes. It is just that simple. So if you are enjoying these episodes, I would love if you would like and subscribe, and in fact, share this with friends. You can find the free pattern in the description below the episodes. You can find a write-up about a previous version of this quilt, the one shown on that picture, in blog post version, so that you can refer back to some of the instructions, see some of the pictures, and see how it came together for me. All that information is there for you, so that hopefully you can make your own scrappy, strippy quilts. There is a tag. My assistant Erin, bless her heart, did this for me. If you post online at all, tag me if you would, Stitched by Susan, so the @ and Stitched by Susan, and or use the hashtag Scrappy Strippy Chevron Quilt. So exactly the title. I would appreciate that. I'm going to look for comments again. Oh gosh, we've got some label comments. Good, good, good. Nita, I embroider my labels or use pre-printed labels. My favorite are buttons with engraved name and then I stitch the date. Ooh, that sounds pretty. Sarah Hartz, and I know who you mean. Sarah Hartz is a designer. Makes nice small write-on labels, super easy to sew on quickly. That's a good tip. I feel like we don't have to be perfectionists, right? We don't have to make the label from scratch and embroider it. If getting it done in some way, in whatever way suits us, is better than waiting for perfection, which is kind of what I've done, hence no labels. Diane is saying Sakura Pigma Micron pen, and I have one of those. I heat set just to be sure regular Sharpies wash out, at least partially. I prefer to embroider most of my labels on my embroidery machine. So I personally don't have an embroidery machine, but this little workshop that I was at QuiltCon, it was actually Varushka Zarate that was teaching it, of Pride and Joy Quilting. And she was showing how to basically do a simple back stitch, how to use your handwriting to write it, and then do a simple back stitch just to make simple embroidery. It was not elaborate or embellished, it was just beautiful. Pauline, I've started printing my labels on t-shirt print paper and then ironing them onto fabric of my choosing and stitching to the back of the quilt when putting the binding on. So I have done that with, I've printed on fabric before, Pauline, but you have to have an inkjet printer, and I currently don't have that. So these are the things, right? That's why you got to choose the way that works for you. Yes, and here it is, Nevelee. I've seen where you can iron the waxy side of freezer paper on fabric to use as inkjet printable fabric. Does anyone know if that makes your labels permanent? Label sheets get pricey. As far as I know it does, they profess that it does. I've not done it on any of my own quilts and washed them long enough to try it out for myself, if that makes sense. If someone else has, please, will you give Nevelee an answer? I'd appreciate that. Diane says, your Bernina sounds louder than I would expect. Does she need a little lubrication? Do you know, I just oiled her this evening, Diane. I suspect it's just the mic picks up certain sounds louder than others, and I'm wearing the one close to my mouth to try and keep it quiet, but I will double check on that. Thanks for the little poke. There we go. Brenda, baby quilt, 48 by 58 and lap size 56 by 72. There you have it. And Diane is saying, for baby quilts, I wait until the birth and put the specifics, date, time, weight, etc. into the label that I embroider. That's such a good idea. And lots of people do have embroidery machines, so that might suit them to a T. My sister has a fairly simple embroidery capability. In other words, she can do a certain amount of fonts, but it's not elaborate. It's not a full-fledged embroidery machine. But she does it very tiny and then works it into her binding. So in other words, it's like 1/4 inch high, her name and the date. And again, it's fairly simple, but it is absolutely permanent, stitched in thread into, and it's subtle because it's just tucked into the edge of the binding, and I do love that. Kathy is saying, I take a square of fabric and fold in half, so from point to point, so that you get a triangle, right? And then sew into binding in the corner, and then use a Pigma Micron pen. Yes, and I have done that in the past, and I think that's probably what I'm going to go back to doing. Although I do know how to embroider by hand, so I might get myself to simply embroider them. Fantastic. Okay, I'll do a little more cutting. I don't think we're going to stay on super long tonight, guys, because I've kind of given you all the tips. Would you like me to run through them again, the cutting tips, or have you kind of got the gist of it as we're going? And don't forget, they're in the blog post too, so you can always check back there. So back to our big camera, and I'm back to pressing. That's where I'm at. So now I need this to be 8.5 wide, so I'll get my trusty little sample here, and I need almost an inch more. So that helps me know what size of strip to choose. I don't think I've used this one at all, so we'll put that on there. I think you might be right, though. I probably need to pull the bobbin casing right out and do a really good clean and oil. That will maybe be tomorrow afternoon's project. Years ago, I had one of my machines in for servicing, and I asked the tech. This was pre-long round frame, but I asked the tech, like, what is the problem he sees the most? And he just laughed. He said, without a doubt, hands down, it's lint. And what he was seeing, and he actually showed me a machine, he was seeing the stitching area, like behind the bobbin casing, so compacted with lint that it was hard, that the machine literally, the bobbin casing couldn't revolve like it should anymore. And I thought, you know, note to self, if all it takes is cleaning to avoid that and avoid that need for servicing, why wouldn't I do that? And I think on my last sewing machine, I think I had it serviced twice in 7 years. And I still have that machine. It just retired when I got this for Nina. Okay, let's make sure that's wide enough. It is indeed. Almost perfect. Okay, now let's make sure we get this cut at the correct angle. I like to look on the paper and look on the wall, just to be sure. I need a downwards facing angle. Do I need any more chunks at the end? I do. So I'm going to cut. You probably can't see it on camera because it's right down in that corner, but I'll show you my cut after I get it done. Bear with me half a second here. So here's my funny little chunk, right? But I need that down in the corner. Perfect. And now, I'm just winging it here. This is not a huge piece left. So I'm just going to get what I can out of it. And I don't think I can get the 8.5 wide. I can only get the 6.5. And that's all right. Eight and a half long, I guess. It is 8.5 wide. Oh gosh. I moved my rotary cutter just a little bit because I'm cutting at such a funny angle. But you know what I'm going to do? It's such a little bit. I'm going to put a pin in it to draw my attention to it. There's a bit of curvature on the bottom of that. But if I'm paying attention, I can line it up to my gray and it'll be fine. There it goes. And it's coming together. Okay, I'm going to do one last session of comments. And then I think we'll call it for today. Linda or Peter, thanks Susan for sharing your skills on International Women's Day. Well, I'm ashamed to say that I did not even know that it was International Women's Day, but you're welcome. That's absolutely a reason to celebrate and to share our skills. Brenda is asking, before your Laura Star, did you use steam in your old-fashioned iron? Yes, I did. I personally am a steamer. I find my seams lay flatter. One of the arguments against it is that it can distort your pieces, but I've sewn for long enough that I know how to control my fabric and keep it under control and from getting distorted. So I prefer to use steam. I love the flatness of the seams that I get with steam. Marcia has a tip. When using an inkjet printer, first treat your fabric with bubble jet set to make the ink more permanent. That's a super tip because that's, of course, of importance that whatever you take the time to put on your label stays there. And picked up several tips during your presentation. Good. Susan is asking, is there a count of how many 8.5 rights or 8.5 lefts somewhere on the blog? I don't see it in the pattern. There's not, Susan, and I've been totally honest about this from the outset. This is not a pattern that I've ever published. It doesn't have enough detail for a published pattern. This is just my notes on making it and my best tips. So, you know, an intermediate level of sewing is required and you're kind of on your own in fitting in the pieces. But I find that it works best to lay out the background with all the holes in it. You're seeing the white holes on mine first. Lay out that background so that you're confident in how many pieces you need. And I cut the background one bit at a time. 1 6.5 inch strip, cut the chevrons and lay them in place. 8.5 inch strip, cut the chevrons and put them in place, right? Until I get it done, so I'm not overshooting the mark. And then at that point, I can visually see how many printed strips I need. And of course, the option is there if you want to make the quilt another chevron wider or another row of chevrons longer. You can easily do that. So I did not think through all those permutations and get them on paper, no. So I hope you can figure that out for yourself. That's great. Look at this, Mr. Producer's just begging for a cribbage game. By the way, I won the tournament earlier today, so we're starting another tournament. Julie's asking, what and how have you made your 48-inch ironing board, wood, batting, etc.? It is super easy, and you can kind of see it here, Julie. It's very inexpensive 9 cubicle section dealies, and they're just the cheapo ones from department store. And we've got 2 of them back to back, right? So then I've got these basket type things in some of the cubicles just to organize things. And then Mr. Producer did this for me. On the bottom of that pair of cabinets, on the bottom he put plywood and heavy casters, and on the top he put a 24 by 48 inch piece of plywood. That's what you're seeing right here. And then I covered it with, I think I have 2 layers of batting and 1 layer of fabric, and it's just cotton fabric. And when the fabric gets scuzzy, I just rip it off and put on new batting and new fabric, and I have like a new ironing board, and that's how I get a fresh new look every year or 2. So that's all it is, super simple. Okay, you guys, thanks so much for tuning in. We'll do another live next week. I don't know yet which day it will be. I'm hopeful for Tuesday or Wednesday, a bit earlier in the week. And this time I'll be working on sewing the strips together. So I'll give you some tips for that one. And I would love if you would post pictures of your own. Facebook, Instagram, both. Let me know how they're coming on. Tag me at StitchedBySusan, and then the hashtag Scrappy Strippy Chevron. That would be lovely. I'd love to see how yours are turning out. I bet everyone's is a little bit different, and that's the beauty of making scrappy quilts, isn't it? No 2 are alike. Well, you guys, thanks for joining me. If you've enjoyed this again, give it a thumbs up and a like. Click the bell if you'd like to be notified whenever I am going live, and feel free to share this with your friends who love making scrappy quilts too. Until next time, happy sewing!